great pleasure to introduce the chairman of this conference. Steve Norris will be known to many of you, been a good friend to Policy Exchange since we worked together on the campaign to save the Routemaster bus. Steve, thank you for all that you've done here, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say, and we can now become the ringmaster for the rest of the proceedings.
Thanks very much for that. As it happens, I was all in favour of scrapping the Routemaster on the grounds that it's completely inaccessible to disabled people, and I'd rather approve of Boris Bus because it is accessible to disabled people. It does all the good hop-on, hop-off features of the old Routemaster, which was rapidly becoming an environmental disaster. So on that extraordinarily unfriendly note, thank you for the introduction. And after that marvellous, I thought, opening session with Danny and Edmund, what we're now going to do in this next hour is to look at the whole question of making cities livable. We just touched in that Edward's last session on the whole issue of supply, demand, character of housing, character of communities. Maybe we need to think a little bit more about concepts such as placemaking, looking at what it is that actually does drive housing supply, whether it's true, as Edward suggests, that actually simply the supply and demand question is answered by ensuring better supply. I suspect that in the case of the United Kingdom, that's very much the answer. Well, we've got three marvellously good speakers to help us with this, each of whom is going to talk for a short while, after which we can have questions and answers. Our first speaker is Howard Husek. Howard is Vice President for Policy Research at the Manhattan Institute, where he's also Director of its Social Entrepreneurship Initiative. He's a contributing editor to City Journal. He's the author of Philanthropy Under Fire and blogs on philanthropy and society on Forbes.com. He has been a Director of Case Studies in Public Policy and Management at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he's also a fellow at the Hauser Center on non-profit organizations. In addition to all of that, Howard's written widely on housing and urban policy, including in his book, The $1 Trillion Housing Mistake, the Failure of American Housing Policy, which I suspect is something we'd all like to hear more about. And he's worked in Boston, he's worked as a mid-career fellow at Princeton, and has an enormously distinguished record in this field. Great pleasure to introduce Howard Husek.
Thank you so much, Steve. I just put on my institutional hat at the Manhattan Institute for a moment here and thank Dean Goodson and everybody at Policy Exchange for collaborating with us. I'd like to recognize especially my colleague Michael Allegretti, who was from our side of things, helped to arrange all of this, and just to say what a pleasure it is to be here as a partner with the Policy Exchange. I hope my remarks can serve as a modest elaboration on Ed Glazer's masterful keynote. It really was, to have that sort of overview, historical and contemporary. It's just wonderful to hear. I think we'd all agree. And I'd like to focus specifically in offering my modest elaboration on housing supply and housing supply for those of modest needs in thinking about this issue of inequality and accommodating those of modest means in our post-industrial cities. The question of housing and planning policies needed to address growing urban populations, and they are growing, aren't they, is an urgent one. It's not urgent just for post-industrial cities, but for Lagos, for New Delhi, for Mumbai. At the same time, it's very useful, I think, to understand that this is a question we have confronted before. At the turn of the 20th century, in the US, for instance, an unprecedented wave of extremely poor people came to our cities, as the cities of the East Coast followed the industrial age model of the UK. I will argue that notwithstanding what might be called progressive era outrage about conditions of that time, and I'll argue that we're still laboring under the burden of that outrage, we actually can look back by historical analogy to that era of successful urbanization, one in which formal housing and planning policies, like those in Atlanta and Dallas today, relatively, were actually at a minimum. So, Although most of the discussion of New York in the late 19th and 20th century focuses on the abominable and crowded conditions of the Lower East Side, the analog of the East End here in London, a more accurate portrait is one of conditions in which thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were successfully accommodated, and the crowded conditions ebbed relatively quickly, such that by 1930, Lillian Wall, who headed something called the Henry Street Settlement on the Lower East Side of New York, observed that her famed social welfare institution was surrounded by empty apartments. Well, what had happened? New York, along with Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and like London, had seen an astounding building boom of housing for those of modest means in an era before social housing, before zoning, and before direct subsidies, indeed before help to buy. That was supposed to be a joke, a contemporary joke, reference. In the rapidly expanding borough of Brooklyn, for instance, in the 50-year period from 1880 to 1930, saw the construction of 520,000 residential structures. 73% of all the housing in what in 1898 was still an independent city. Another fact I think was important. The housing, moreover, was a cornucopia of varieties for those of modest means, including tens of thousands of 2, 3, 4, 8, and 12, getting to density structures, 21,000 1 to 4, a fact I happen to like, 21,000 1 to 4 family homes with ground floor businesses. Entrepreneurs were living on the ground floor, renting out the top floors. These various structures, I held, did more than just give places to live. They provided a route to upward mobility for those families which were moving up and out of tenement neighborhoods. Same story was repeated in Philadelphia, which built 299,000 attached row homes. In Chicago, which built a vast bungalow belt, which included 382 2, 3, and 4 family homes. Such structures in all of these cities were housing not for the poorest, but steps up of what I would call the housing ladder for the upwardly mobile of still relatively limited means. It was housing within their reach to purchase, housing which could provide a rental income or an adjoining place of employment, housing which could then be sold as their economics improved and they would consolidate their gains and move up the economic ladder. The idea that there was a massive and fundamental market failure before the era of social housing and vast state intervention is simply incorrect historically. It's worth reflecting on the factors which made this housing explosion possible, just in case we might want one again today. First, this was, for the most part, an era before elaborate permitting processes, an era of generally as-of-right construction. It was driven by private builders in what the historian Peter Ackroyd, in his biography of London, called a fever of construction driven by profit and profiteering. Private builders gauged the public taste and were allowed to provide for it. But this is by no means the whole story. Public investment mattered greatly as well. In New York, for instance, the $24 million construction of the Williamsburg Bridge in 1903 directly connected the Lower East Side with the expanding borough of Brooklyn. People moved out en masse. They could own their own row house and walk across the bridge to those garment factories that Ed was talking about. Public amenities complemented publicly financed infrastructure. Many of these had a philanthropic dimension. The philanthropist industrialist Andrew Carnegie made a gift in 1899 of $5 million, that would be $147 million in current dollars, that financed the construction of no fewer than 67 public libraries in New York City as a whole. That included 21 neighborhood libraries in Brooklyn. Then there were the public parks. While it was still an independent city, Brooklyn invested $9 million in land acquisition and the construction of a 585 park called Prospect Park, completed in 1873. And over the subsequent 50 years, this park would be surrounded by a dazzling variety of physical and economic housing types, from attached single families to elegant apartment buildings, and a beautiful parkway which was lined by these buildings. Finally, though I doubt we can really identify all the factors that made this housing boom policy, there was transit. Privately financed construction of elevated trains with public help, open to development areas heretofore too distant to be practical residence for those with employment in the central city. Indeed, early transit investors, such as those who developed amusement parks and wanted people to come out to see them, and ultimately to buy homes in those areas, played a key role. As transit historian Mark Feynman has written in his history of Brooklyn rapid transit, new areas of the land would become accessible, and with trains running over Brooklyn Bridge to Park Row, the commerce city of New York would be a shorter ride away. Keep that in mind. That's something, shorter rides still matter today as well. So, here's where I'm going. What lessons can we learn from this era I'm portraying as an historical housing production success? Certainly, we are not going to fully replicate the preconditions for this production. We're not likely to stop being concerned about construction in environmentally sensitive areas, nor are we going to abandon building codes requiring access for the disabled. There are other things that are the aspects of a wealthier and more caring society. But we can do our best to make as-of-right construction a relative default norm, to permit housing developers to understand in advance, based on clear and simple rules, what may and may not be built on a given lot, without protracted regulatory and legal proceedings being required to gain permission to do so. It's worth noting also, in the US during the era I've been talking about, municipal governments, such as those in Brooklyn, realized property tax revenues as the result of improvements on the land in their jurisdictions. This is a very, very important point. They had an incentive to accept, not to stymie, new development. When local councils see a situation in which they are likely to inherit traffic jams and greater density, but not to realize greater revenues, it's a recipe for NIMBYism. In the era of great housing production, and with local devolution as it exists in the United States, one can realize gains as well as incurring costs. This, along with public improvements, whether financed by government, philanthropy, or private investment, but with government permission, were key a century ago and can be so again today. Indeed, as the Financial Times recently editorialized in the context of its observations about why increased housing supply, not rent control, is the right approach to addressing current London area high housing prices, local authorities should also be given the powers to designate land for new settlements, including allowing the benefits of increases in land value to be shared by investors and local government. Indeed, planning decisions through zoning with proper incentives can make possible the density of construction, which is, as Ed Glazer made clear, the surest way to affordability. More units mean more supply, means lower prices. This is a far surer approach to affordability than subsidy programs or elaborate social housing, or as we call it in the US, public housing. Why do I assert this with such certainty? Because in my view, I want to really emphasize this, the variety of housing types from a century ago did more than produce supply. They helped the poor to advance, to be part of this growing city. Owner-occupied housing was quite common, even in very poor areas. Ownership with rental income is a way to accumulate wealth. Transit and amenities can still serve to reduce prices today. I'm not an expert on the London housing market, but I know enough to prepare for this panel by looking at the House and Home section of the Weekend Financial Times, and there I learned that even as home prices have hit new highs, there are suburbs where, rather than heading a couple hours out of London, better transit connections are decreasing prices. They mentioned Crookham, Locksbottom, and Rickmansworth. I don't know where those places are, but they mentioned it. That, of course, implies transit connections, which can make property accessible and valuable just by becoming more efficient. I can't help, however, to pause here in this discussion of the preconditions for supply and upward mobility for the poor to talk about some of the mistakes that we've made based on the conclusion from the progressive era of massive market failure. Social housing was and remains a terrible false path that we took that gives us a hangover that we're still dealing with. We think about it in terms of, well, concentrations of the poor, and that was a bad thing. It's worse for so many other reasons that you still have to deal with in London today. It freezes in place in a particular use, in something like perpetuity, housing for people of a certain economic group. We know that cities live and breathe. They change. By freezing the city, we don't permit it to go, land to go to its highest and best use. That means that the smart people who want to start new businesses may not have a place to do it in ways that would help all social classes. I'm afraid that our reaction to social housing is still giving us a problem. I refer here to something which is now out in New York, inclusionary zoning. And I understand that this is popular here in London as well, in which there will be a set-aside number of units in market rate buildings for people of modest means. This is a great concern as well. Again, and I'm not worried about whether the rich are somehow going to be disadvantaged or have to live with people they may not like. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about people with modest means and how they advance. So the poor that come to the city get ahead. If you have an especially good deal on an apartment, you're likely to stay put, just as those people in social housing are frozen in place, even if their jobs in other parts of the city or other parts of the country. We dare not help people in these ways that are likely to hurt them. And I leave you with this note that poor neighborhoods of modest people with modest means can be good neighborhoods. They can have libraries, parks, good transit connections, and those are the kind of neighborhoods we look to encourage through the constellation of policies that we discovered a century ago and can rediscover today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Howard. There's plenty there for us to think on and to talk about later, I hope. Our next speaker is Nicholas Boyce-Smith. He was an advisor on welfare policy to Peter Lilly when he was Secretary of State for Social Security. Prior to that, he worked at McKinsey, or after that, I should say, worked at McKinsey for 6 years, then served as Secretary of the Tax Reform Commission, set up by George Osborne. He's published 2 influential studies on the re-regulation of the British economy, and he's written widely for the think tank Reform. He now runs his own social enterprise, an independent research institute called Create Streets, focusing on the built environment, with which he co-published a report with Policy Exchange called Create Streets on the benefits of intelligent housing policy. Nick.
Thank you. It's an interesting testament to the times we live in. For 6 or 7 years I was a banker, and that's been entirely expunged from the record that you got.
I'm going to let you go off to a good start.
No. I quit while you're behind. I was furious at the previous session. I came in late and I missed most of the talk, but I did catch the questions. And when Edward Close made reference to loving London, I thought, great, I'll start my talk by telling a joke about Harold Wilson and Chatham. And it started Those of you who have small children may have had the misfortune to go and see the Lego movie. It has in it a song, one of those songs that is simultaneously awful, but that you can't stop rattling in your head. I've had rattling around my head for the last month for song, Everything is Awesome. So I'm afraid I'm the person who's come today to tell you that everything in London isn't quite awesome, and to explain some of the things I think we're doing wrong, and why I think we are at grave risk of repeating, not quite as badly, but of repeating many of the errors that London and many British cities made 50 years ago. Let me just give you 2 seconds on Create Streets, otherwise you'll all be thinking, where's this guy coming from? So, when I gave up my job as a banker, I set up Create Streets, which was a social enterprise. We are focused on research on the built environment, above all on correlations between built form and social outcome, above all on evidence on what people want, how they wish to live, and looking not at the economics of a deal, not at the economics of building something, but at the 20, 30, 50-year economics of what types of property hold their value. We use that then to lobby for policy change, because we think there's some big errors happening at the moment. We've had 3 modest victories already. We've managed to, we've only been in 8 months now, we've managed to persuade the Treasury to create 150 million funds to look at estate regeneration in a new way. I'll come to that later. We've persuaded the government to commission Savills to investigate some of the ideas we're putting forward, and we've managed to get one modest change in the London plan. We're still strategically losing incredibly badly, but we're making a few little tactical inroads. So that's where I'm coming from. I've talked to those. The game here, just before I get into the detail of the evidence, the game here is there was an enormous amount of regeneration post-war in London. Some of it in consequence of bombing, much of it in consequence because of, if you like, thoughts about how people should live. That's created large areas of London which are, on the whole, very low density. The population of Southwark went down by 2/3, that Tower Hamlets by rather less, when they regenerated large parts of London in the 50s, 60s and 70s. If we replace those, as we come to that, if we replace those with dense terrace streets, as a model of Pimlico or to Clapham or Notting Hill, by our estimates, we've increased the number of units in near central or central London by about 200, 300,000. The initial Savills work is actually higher than that, actually at the top end of that range, more in the 500 to 600. So we don't quite yet know, we're still working on numbers. But that's even on the current increased London plan requirements of 42,000 private units required a year in London. That's over a decade of supply. So there's an enormous opportunity in London to, if you like, return to the original streetscape in a more dense version and, quote unquote, solve the whole housing crisis, at least for generation. Let's go back a bit. The data is off the scale clear. Oh, there's a thing there, I can look at that. Fantastic. The data is off the scale clear that streets are more popular. Not with everyone, there's a consistent minority of people in the UK and in every country. It changes a bit country to country, and the UK is more at one extreme, but not off the scale. Depending on how you ask the question, depending on who you ask it, depending on when you ask it, depending on what's been in the news the last few weeks and months, something between 1 and 20% of British people want to live in a non-conventional arrangement. There was an Ipsos Mori poll, which I quote there in 2002, where only 2% wanted to. A more recent one last year by Ipsos Mori in the UK, where 3% of people wanted to live in a large apartment block. There was a recent research done by Ipsos Mori in London, which excluded people over the age of 64, that said 26% of people, I think, were prepared to live in a skyscraper. So, it varies. There are also consistent majorities of people in some of the big post-war housing estates and big buildings who say they would rather live in a house or in a more conventional street. As I say, it's never everyone, but it's a strong majority. Reasons given, this is just from a recent YouGov focus group done in 2012, fairly consistent themes. I've got here a quote, which if you'll forgive me, I'll read from George Orwell. As the dawning bombers were nosing their way up the Thames, he wrote in 1940, all the culture that is most truly native centres around things which are not official: the pub, the back garden, the fireside, the nice cup of tea, the liberty of the individual, the liberty to have a home of your own, to choose your own amusements instead of having them chosen for you from above. And I'd argue those quotes there, taken from a focus group, show you why George Orwell is such a brilliant writer, because he has encapsulated themes of individuality and liberty and self-control, which I think you can see in some of the quotes there, which I won't read out to you, I'm assuming you can read. That actually gets, in that context of all the post-war social housing construction in London and other cities, that gets to what, to me, is an incredibly important point. I think streets are more socially just. Perhaps the key number to focus on there is the one in bold. The latest data we've got is from the 2001 census. We're still waiting for this bit of data from the 2011 census. But in the 2001 census, if you were a child in social housing, you were 16 times more likely to live on or above the 5th floor than a child in private housing. The same is true in London. We don't yet have figures as over 3 years ago. Why is that a question of social justice? Why is that a question of choice? Because streets are good for you. And this is a bit like I really irritate some architects. I'm not an architectural determinist. I'm not arguing that who we are, what we are is defined by where we live. That would be palpably absurd. But I don't think it's unreasonable. I mean, ask yourselves a question. How do you respond to different physical environments? Places of beauty, whether in the countryside or in the street, it does something to you. More importantly, where you live, how that's set up, particularly with young children, affects what's easy to do or not to do. We found, actually, this slide's a little bit old, actually, the number's gone up now. We found 42 studies, it's 44, 45 now, where statistically robust, peer-reviewed pieces of research, adjusting for socioeconomic status, I'm not comparing the banker to the bin man, try and look at different aspects of happiness, contentment, or social outcome. In all but two of them, the academics who do the research find a positive correlation between living in a smaller building, or living nearer the ground, or living in a house, or living in a flat on lower floors, versus living higher or further away from the ground. An early sample, military families in the 1960s, mental health far better with those who are living in smaller flats or near the ground. Children, the most consistent theme on this. Antisocial behaviour, where the degree of crime or of antisocial behaviour that you get in most studies, not quite all, is correlated not just with the increase of population, but with the different built forms. It goes beyond the differential that the population difference would explain. Why is this? I'll come back to that actually. I think three themes probably come out of the data. I'm hypothesising a little bit here. The first is it is just much harder to bring up children, above all small children, when you're a long way from your own private or what's in there, it's semi-private communal space. There's a lot of anecdotal information. If you're a mum with small children living on a corridor or a stairwell on the 15th floor, what do you do to take the energy out of your children? It's hard to physically look after them if you're trying to cook dinner, if the playground is downstairs and out of sight. It's just a hard thing to manage. I think that's one key thing. A second thing, perhaps a little bit more nebulous, but I think very clear, there's consistent evidence that most people say they know more people and they feel more sociable when they live in more conventional urban arrangements. There is some data that shows people know their immediate neighbours well in tower blocks or in very big blocks, but they tend to know the broader community far less well. There are counterexamples, and I'm not in any of this saying that all tower blocks or all big buildings are bad, or that they don't work for everyone. They don't work for anyone. They do work for some people love them, but the tendency is that most people behave in this way. There's a great piece of research from I just mentioned it there, from the early 80s, a lovely US study where they asked US students, they left Santos envelopes, wallets, and requested charitable donations in halls of residence of differing scales and different floors. And you can probably see where the sentence is going. They found a negative correlation between the height at which the students lived and the size of the building and their propensity to return the wallet, post a stamp address envelope, or make a charitable donation. And that's a lovely, beautiful controlled study that actually shows real behaviour, not just what people say. The third one, which is probably the most familiar to many of you around the room, is that it's just much harder to police the semi-private, semi-public spaces that big buildings necessitate. The stairwell, the corridor. Anyone who has campaigned and gone canvassing will know that very well, that they can be quite threatening places. Now, that can work well for rich people. Rich people commit less crime. I don't make a judgment, I just state a fact, at least they commit a different type of crime. The Barbican around here always gets cited at me. Well, the Barbican is not performing the purpose it was originally set out to perform. It is housing largely childless people who work in the city of high or very high incomes. That is not why it was created, and it's not in large part. So it can work, but when you've got a more mixed social group where there are more potential issues, it's harder to make do. Now, you can sort of pay your way out of that, and a lot of work was done on this in the 80s. Concierge, CCTV, gating, but I ask you, is that the type of spirit that most people want to live in, one of a Fort Knox type community? Indeed, there are many quotes from councillors complaining in the 80s that all these changes that were being made, we're going to turn it into Fort Knox or a sort of a prison-style mentality, which in some ways they do. So I don't say you can't partly get out of that problem, but it's expensive. That works well in Manhattan, where you can pay for that livery concierge, where you can pay for the posh man in the front who, when she hits the fan, actually is the bouncer. But it doesn't work so well in social housing. And it certainly doesn't work so well when you've got dense enclaves of social housing, which we're in danger of recreating. We'll come back to that. Streets aren't just a good idea because they're good for you and most people like them. They're actually incredibly practical. That is an appalling slide, I do apologise. Let me try and summarise it, which is that it costs more to manage big buildings. So it can cost more to build them because there are far fewer companies that can make them. They charge a higher margin, and it costs far more to manage them per square foot and per hectare. That again works when you've got consistently and predictably high commercial, retail, or residential rents. So again, I don't argue that these things can't work in central London, but it's harder and more dangerous to make them work over time in more marginal areas. This is quite a simple piece of analysis, just looking at Halifax data in the region of London. There's a similar picture with slightly different numbers, comes out in every region in the UK. The most rational, the most self-interested and natively selfish thing to own 30 years ago was an old terraced house or an old bit of mansion block in every part of the UK. You doubled your money compared to owning something in a less conventional urban arrangement built in the last 40 years. It's not a perfect piece of analysis because the Halifax data doesn't split on urban arrangement, it splits on style and date, but taking that as a proxy. Put differently, that was a marvellous thing to own since the early 80s, you made your money many times over. That was a much less good thing to own a slice of, and indeed it's much harder to get a mortgage in many of them. Many people in near central London who bought flats in places, literally in those buildings, now find it hard to sell them. And just in case you're thinking, so how people think, oh, well, that's just because the stuff that was built 40 years ago was rubbish. Actually, no, it wasn't. It had parking or space standards. It was much more generously proportioned internally than the stuff that's being built now. There are tower blocks built 15 years ago near to Docklands, free uppies, for rich people working in the city, where the rich people in the city just don't seem to want to live there. And they're now largely, in some cases entirely, repositories for people who are unintentionally homeless. So stuff that was being built this century is recreating the economic pattern of this. This is a piece of work from Savills for the Princess Foundation, where they looked, I apologise, I'm going to step away from the microphone, there's just too many numbers, so I'll talk louder. Sorry for the recorders. This is what we're talking about here, dense terrace streets. They're making a comparison here to, if you like, a lower density piece of suburbanism, and this is the old city. They looked at 3 developments in Buckinghamshire in Scotland. They found that the uplift over 4 or 5 or 6 years per hectare and per square foot, so the value to the investor was higher, if you like, it was 32% higher than a suburban model, and 12% higher actually than the old city per hectare, in terms of the overall land area, and per square foot developed. I even taking account of differing densities. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. It was 9% higher per square foot and 27% higher than the old standard density. So the sensible thing to do as a long-term investor over this decade was to build a slightly lower density but nevertheless high density streetscape. That was the most rational thing, the most selfish thing to do. I'll leave this just in case I'm tempted again. This is some interesting work by Space Syntax, some of you may know, who they look at the differing values of streets. And they find that the streets that are best connected, the streets that connect to the most other streets, are the most valuable. But once you get streets that are partly hived off by areas where you don't have normal streets and where you have more indeterminate bits of space, whether that's a little bit of park, or most crucially, areas where you've got a walkway here and it's there, tend to be worth far less. And you can see that in commercial rents and you can see it in residential values. Space Syntax, I don't cite it here, they obviously did a fascinating piece of work immediately after the riots in London a couple of years ago, where they showed that, I forget the numbers, I think in the north of London it was 98%, in the south of London it was 92%, but those numbers may be wrong, but it was certainly in that order, that nearly all of the riots happened very close to a piece of post-war social housing estate near to an urban centre. Literally nearly every single one. The other reason that streets are practical is they can be incredibly high density, and I apologise to those of you who are urban designers who will know this slide very well. This was used actually in the Rogers report 10 years ago. Pick this up again. So this is we're building a much higher density now. This is a typical post-war tower in the sky. actually much lower density than what was there before, 75 units per hectare. This is terraced housing, 75 units per hectare. This is a mixture of mansion blocks and flats around the square, 75 units per hectare. Now, at that density, or at high variance of the same density, streets can match, you can't get the very highest density through streets. Clearly, if you want to build nothing but tower blocks, you can't match that. But you can match or substantially up to about 40 or 50% increase on our numbers, most of the tower blocks in the estates that were built post-war. So we can revert from those to higher density streetscapes. Now, what's actually going on? So come back to that. Let me go here. Hang on, I'm losing my way here. I want to show something else. This one. What we're actually doing is replicating many of the areas of the past. So this, it's a bit unfair to go this one, but this is a 1930s series of natural rocks. And what we're doing is knocking down and building the same, but just a bit bigger. There's something that's called the street on the side, but it's basically just the same. Let me take this one as well. This is the Aylesbury estate in Southwark. This is the regeneration here. It's just north of a park. Because there are rules about the space that needs to be left open, there are a few streets up at the top of the site, and then there's a series of blocks, big blocks to the south, some of them which are 100% social housing. So I would, and to come back to my own line, everything isn't quite awesome. I think we're replicating too many of the areas of the past. Now, why is that? Well, one of the reasons is it's almost impossible now to build conventional London. If you try to build Pimlico or Notting Hill or Clerkenwell, you fall foul of rule after rule after rule after rule. Are you trying to stop me? I'll be quick. Rules on light, rules on space, rules on staircases, rules on lift, rules on open space, rule after rule. And we're not just talking about this, we're actually trying to get involved with real developments, and we're finding these problems unreal. I'll stop in the next 2 seconds, I promise, Mr. Chairman. Let me just make one point. So what we're arguing for is funds that force developers and the public sector to look at the value of investments over the next 30, 40, 50 years. A social impact bond to force developers to think about what's going to happen to the people who live in the regeneration that happens. Actually, I'll leave it at that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. The trouble is, I think there's so much there, we could have listened to that for hours, because it is hugely significant, and in my experience in London, absolutely vital issue that we don't spend enough time addressing. But sadly, time is always such a dreadful constraint, and I did want to allow our third speaker again as much time, and then perhaps we can squeeze in one or two questions. Our third speaker is Ricky Burdett. I've known Ricky for 30 years. He's now Professor of Urban Studies at the LSE. He's Deputy Head of the Department of Sociology, and he's the Director of LSE's Cities in the Urban Age programme. He's a Global Distinguished Professor at New York University and Visiting Professor in Urban Planning and Design at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. He was Chief Advisor on Architecture and Urbanism for the London 2012 Olympics. He's an advisor to the Legacy Park Company. He was architectural advisor to a mayor of London from 2001 to 2006. Do your own history. He's a member of the UK Government's Airports Commission. Yeah, you'd have been on my team as well, Ricky, don't worry. And represents 10 Downing Street on the steering committee for the £50 million Old Street Innovation Hub in London. In short, if there's been an issue around urbanism in this city, Ricky Burdett has been there. Ricky.
What I'd like to do is go back to the bigger issue of this conference, which is comparing American cities and British cities, which is of course impossible to do in a comprehensive way, and try and focus on this issue of livability. But unlike the previous speaker, go bigger scale, on the very important sort of smaller scale that has been spoken about. I must say, I wonder whether I should be a criminal or something else. I was brought up on the 5th floor in an apartment block in Rome, but I seem to have survived. I mean, there are deeply cultural issues here which need to be addressed. Now, before we go back to understanding American or British cities, which is what this discussion today is about, in a sort of post-industrial society, I think it's just salutary for us to remember, by looking at this map, it's probably quite difficult from the back of the room to see what's happening, but it's a world map which tracks where cities are growing fastest in the next 20 years, according to the UN. And basically the yellow, and you can see that from wherever you are, is where cities are growing most and fastest. Green is where they've grown in my lifetime. So simply put, Europe and the US, with a few exceptions, is not where it's happening. But I think nonetheless we need to understand the trends and what they're about. Now, not unlike Ed earlier, probably there are three sort of areas that I want to talk about in these few minutes around the notion of livability, and that's to do with density, that's to do with inequality, and that's to do with infrastructure, and how infrastructure is part of that. And clearly London has one dimension, you've seen it, you all know it very well, but it also has that. You know, London is made up of at least two dimensions. The American city, if one wants to generalize enormously and exclude New York, even though I'll come back to that, this LA, it could be Atlanta, it could be Phoenix, is much to do with this. It's much to do with living in the sort of low-density homes, car-driven, dependent environment, which creates a sort of world. What I want to do is just take you through this graph. I don't know whether you can see it, Stephen, or others, but it tracks two important different dimensions. Along the horizontal axis is the Human Development Index. Basically, the further right you are, the higher the employment level, higher productivity, longer life expectancy, etc. On the left-hand side, the opposite. So in fact, you'll find countries like India, African cities, more along the left-hand side, and the United States on the right. On the vertical axis, you have energy consumption per capita. So basically the ecological footprint. And here I want to very much link Ed's point about design, density, and the environment. Because what you see is that on the whole, the trend has been over the years, this is tracking around 300 cities, that as the quality of life, let's call it that, livability perhaps even, improves, so does the need to use more energy. Or does it? Or, more importantly, can we sustain it? Because if you look at this other line, it tells you how much energy we actually have in one Earth at that particular point. So very simply put, if you want to live at this level, you need 5 Earths to actually keep the system going. So I think the question for us in terms of livability, in terms of sustainability, both at the social and the environmental level, is to find something, a model of city dwelling, city planning, and city formation, which actually in a way brings these two together. And I think that has a lot to do with mixing people of different backgrounds close together in humane and livable environments. To talk about that, I want to look at 3 cities, London, New York, and Hong Kong, as a sort of important comparator in terms of this issue of density and how far do we go. Now, these are environments you know extremely well. London, actually a low-density city, relatively speaking. New York, a city which has very, very dense core, but then it spreads out. And Hong Kong, all very, very condensed. Now, if you compare the residential density, where people live, not where people work, in London, you get this image. The green areas show you that actually the densest parts, and this is taking Nicholas' point from before, are not what you expect as the tower blocks, not at all. In fact, the 2 densest neighbourhoods in London are Earl's Court and Notting Hill. Not shabby places when it comes to value and other things. This is New York in blue. So go back, look at green, that's London. That's roughly speaking 8 million people living in London. That's New York, roughly the same population, in fact twice or 2.5 times the density, living in a smaller footprint. But this is extraordinary. This is Hong Kong, 7 million people, actually at much higher densities. Now, I'm not making an argument that we all want to live that way. I'm just making an argument of what decisions are being made in cities and the US, in the US and the UK, in terms of which way we want to go. And I think in terms of linking Ed's key points about the economy and sustainability at the level of access to jobs, the relationship between residential density where people work is absolutely central. I mean, it's enough to come here, this part of London, at 8:45 in the morning to understand this diagram in a very real way. The sheer number of people just spewing out of underground stations or railway stations and walking to their office is really quite extraordinary. And you see it right here in this diagram. On the left-hand side is where people live, what I showed you before. On the right-hand side is actually where people work. And that's hundreds of thousands of people coming into the City of London on a daily basis, using, of course, massive rail infrastructure, which has been built up for the last 120 years. You also see parts of denser work employment areas in Canary Wharf emerging. This is exactly the same diagram for New York. So you have the density residential we see there, and even higher peaks of people coming into New York, particularly downtown and midtown, again sustained by a very, very robust, perhaps a little bit creaky public transport system. But here is Hong Kong. I stress this is not a model I'm saying we all want, but in terms of sort of the big issues facing any of our cities, is this something we need to understand? The need to actually live in higher densities in order to have an efficient footplate means that you actually have an average commuting time of something like 15 minutes in a city of 7 million people, and 93% of the population uses public transport to get to work. That's what we're talking about. And I think the issues that need to be understood are at the level of infrastructure investment around that. I want to turn to the second point, having talked about density, which is the one about equity. Now, this map could have been drawn in 1889 by Charles Booth. It's not. It was updated only quite recently, and it shows in red where people who are most deprived in the city live. That means a lower level of education, higher teenage pregnancies, etc. And in green, where the opposite end, the more affluent, the more educated, the more prosperous live. And London, every city has obviously a distribution of the sort. London has a particular one, which is familiar to us. A lot of East London, some of South London is more deprived. The edges of London are instead quite affluent, and much of West London. If you did that to Paris, it's exactly the opposite. So the issues of livability are to do with how do you deal and how do you in a way distribute this wealth, and I guess issues of density and infrastructure are part of that. Now, what we did at the LSE is compare two cities from the point of view of ethnic distribution, which of course lies behind a map like this, ethnic distribution in New York and London, and then compare that to deprivation and income. Now, in London, on the left, you will recognize clusters of areas where either Pakistanis, Bangladeshi, Portuguese or others actually live. On the right-hand side, for those of you who know New York well, you can see the concentration of Hispanics, African blacks, either in Harlem or in the Bronx or in Queens. What is interesting, if you look at the right-hand map, you can see those sort of darker areas, and now look at the next map, which is income distribution. There's a much closer fit between concentration of ethnic minorities in New York and deprivation than there is in London. There's a much more of a mix. It's not obvious that sort of certain areas of West London, which are actually relatively wealthy, are also concentrations of high ethnic minorities. Now, I think that's a very important part of a tolerant and mixed and livable city, which I think needs to be understood. If you take the classic American city, one of the most beautiful, wonderful cities in the world, Chicago, and look at the ethnic distribution, it is quite extraordinary when you see these maps done by several research institutions in the United States. In the blue dots, you see black population, you can see Hispanic in yellow, and the white population in sort of the purple pink. how clearly divided that city is. That doesn't, of course, mean that all of South Chicago is problematic, but there are more concentrations of that sort. Washington, D.C., not dissimilar. You have a complete split between where people, one color or the other, live. Now, I want to end going back to the infrastructure issue. It was very interesting to hear Ed's comments about high-speed rail and what level of investment should be made or should not be made in response to Dan's questions of infrastructure of this sort. And let's take CROSSRAIL as an example in terms of what one does in terms of retrofitting cities. I think the challenge for a UK city, but also certainly for American cities, and would be interested to hear your comments on that, is to address this issue, but in the context of inequality. So if you take the map of deprivation that I showed you earlier of London, the redder colours are the more deprived areas, and you overlay the CROSSRAIL line over it, I think you do begin to see a sort of investment that over the next 20, 30, maybe 40, 50 years would really make a difference. Because if you begin to provide access to jobs, to everything else, to all the elements that Ed was talking about in his earlier talk, all the benefits of sort of densified city, which means access not only to jobs but also to public services, to culture and education. In that way, you might actually create, at the macro level, not the scale that was just being talked about, a more sort of livable city across the board, of course, becoming an opportunity for provision of the sort of housing that you were talking about a moment ago. So that's really to give a picture of how American cities certainly differ from UK cities, how London differs from others, but that at the heart of the discussion of making livable cities are these big, I think, discussions about density, about infrastructure investment, which are fundamentally political questions rather than just design questions. Thank you very much.